Well, Kim, in what seems like a blink of an eye, a month has gone by, and it's time for our monthly kind of assessment of U.S. politics, looking at the month that has just passed and looking ahead to the month that is yet to be. But it seems at the same time like an entire lifetime. So much has changed in the month of July. You had obviously the attempted assassination of a U.S. president, a real low light in terms of the regularity of violence in American politics. So if you take a long-term historical perspective, a Republican convention, the selection of a Republican vice presidential candidate in J.D. Vance, and then over the last just week, the entire race seemed to be turned on its head, with the Democratic candidate, current President Joe Biden, stepping down from the race, and the apparent assumption of that role by his Vice President Kamala Harris. So again, a lifetime in a month, it seems like. So before we talk about what's coming down the pike, let's spend a little bit of time talking about July 2024. What has struck you? What do you think that students of American politics or our community need to understand about what they've seen over the last 5 weeks?
Well, firstly, I am so happy. It has to be said. We've got a contestable election. You've got a good Democrat candidate, which I would not have said, I must admit, 6 months ago, because I have actually been expecting Biden to go. I didn't think he'd cling on so firmly, but I thought he would, and if he'd gone, say, at the beginning of the race, then you'd have had an all-in from the Democrats. But his timing, and I think it really did mean I was wrong about him. He did not intend to leave this contest, but he was persuaded by people with polls. And the people with polls said that the Democratic Party would be destroyed, and not only him, but down the ticket. So all sorts of things went from that resignation on his part. But one of the things that did not come from that resignation, but which is going to be, I think, a real help to Kamala, and that is, he hasn't got a bad reputation. This has been a good presidency. It passes on no baggage. So she can dip in and out of the achievements of the last 3 and a bit years, and that which aids her campaign. Now, are coming at her on the border issues. But she's got a good out there too. They actually had a solution. The solution was agreed by most of the Republicans, but they were forbidden to support it. And in the gilded state of the Congress at the moment, they basically went along with what Trump wanted. But Trump can complain all he likes, and she can say, well, we all supported a solution which you forbade. So we've had 6 months because of what you did, in which people have come across the border. Thank you very much, would-be president.
Now, you've highlighted something that I think will be a focus over the next 90 plus days left in the election. For me, I was really struck by some areas where I was wrong. I had anticipated, the morning I woke up to the horrific news that there was an attempt made on the life of a U.S. presidential candidate, and the gunshots that rang out in Pennsylvania really left me with this sick feeling, just because of the introduction of violence into the political process, but also the risk to the president as a person and those around him. And on a political level, I assumed that his physically courageous response to that attempted assassination attempt and the imagery associated with blood streaming down his face and his fist pump saying "fight, fight, fight" with flags in the background, so perfectly framed, would shake up the race.
Yeah.
It didn't.
No.
There wasn't a bump that I anticipated, which implies that people have pretty much made up their mind about him as a candidate, regardless of what happens. And in a similar fashion, the Republican National Congress went forth as anticipated. They selected a young, very articulate, Ivy League educated, and yet street cred containing vice presidential candidate in J.D. Vance. And once again, I anticipated, as always, that there would be a bump in the polls. In fact, there's a word for it. It's the post-convention bump.
Yeah.
And again, it didn't happen. There was relative stagnancy in the polls until the events that you described. And what I think was a truly selfless and very difficult decision on the part of our current president, or the U.S.'s current president, Joe Biden, to step down from the campaign. And then the rapid coalition of the Democratic Party around Kamala Harris has really kind of shaken everything up, changed everything quite dramatically. When I say shaken everything up or turned it on its head, I mean that in the blink of an eye, you've gone from a narrative where the Republicans spent the better part of a year making the entire campaign about the worthiness or the physical capability of an elderly candidate to carry on the responsibilities of the presidency. And again, in the blink of an eye, the Republicans have now nominated the oldest presidential nominee in American history, because 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, when Biden was nominated, he was then the oldest. Now Trump is the oldest. And so all that focus and all that narrative about mental acuity is going to be shifting in a different direction, so on its head. One of the most interesting polls for me was on the 16th of July, an NBC poll going into the Republican convention. They asked Democratic and Republican voters if they were satisfied with their party's choice, right? And it was quite remarkable. 71% of Republicans said yes, 29% said no. I think I've got the figures exactly right. The shocking thing is, on Democratic side, only 34% said they were satisfied, over 60% said they were not satisfied, right? We haven't seen polls on that same question right now, but judging by the last 7-8 days, I would think that the support for Kamala Harris is well into the 80s, if not the 90 percentile. So again, that's completely turned itself on its head. So that fundamental assumption about voter enthusiasm that you were talking about has kind of fundamentally altered, and the narrative has shifted. And so we've gone from a narrative about two old men who are both in net negatives in terms of their favorability ratings, and it was an election primarily about who do you dislike more. And now the narrative has shifted, and it's kind of a prosecutor versus a convicted felon, a woman versus somebody who continues to take credit for the reversal of Roe versus Wade, someone young versus someone old. And so just the entire race has been shaken up, and we have yet to see the Democratic convention. So anything else about the last month that you would want to hearken on before we talk about the future?
I never noticed when I watched bits and pieces of the Republican convention. I can't say I watched it all through, but I've been to Republican conventions before. And what they do at Republican conventions normally is they hark back to the great and good of the past eras. There were no actual Republicans at the Republican convention. They were just most of the delegates there were Trump cultists. And that, I think, is a problem going forward. I think it is a problem because I do think that now that Kamala's in the race and it's not Biden, there'll be a lot of Republicans a bit inclined to sit it out. So that's one good thing. The second good thing I note from that is I think it gives the House of Representatives a chance. I think having her at the top of the ticket, no matter what the outcome is, it's going to be close. And close takes a Republican majority out of the House. That could be a very good thing.
So that's based on your presumption that the anticipated red wave that didn't really eventuate in 2022 or back in 2018 might have actually happened in 2024 if things hadn't changed, but now that things have changed, that may be off the table.
It would have occurred not because of people voting for the Republican candidates, but people not voting for the Democrat candidate.
So one really important distinction, which is really important for our Australian community to understand, and it's worth repeating over and over again, is that unlike Australia, where thanks to the efforts of political leaders past, we've got a very strong Australian Electoral Commission, and we have mandatory voting, or technically mandatory attendance at the polls.
Exactly.
You've got to show up, right? And that means that the fundamental dynamic is different. And those questions of voter enthusiasm, those questions of a ground game, get out the vote, voter registration, voting plans, those are really, really important in the United States because if your people don't vote, it doesn't matter what the polls show, it's who actually shows up on voting day to vote.
That's the first thing you do. You're assisted in the US because people put down, are you a registered Democrat? Are you a registered Republican? Are you registered with someone else? And there are people registered with others, like independents, but in New York you get Conservatives and you get Social Democrats and that sort of thing. Very small numbers. But, so you know whose door to knock on. That's which is a great guide in a non-compulsory voting thing to who you need to concentrate on.
So before we transition to looking ahead to August, your last comment reminds me of one other thing that happened in the month of July that I don't think many people have paid attention to. Is this is not necessarily just a Republican versus Democratic race. There's always a number of minor candidates, but there was one minor candidate who at times in the last 6 months had polled as high as 15% in the polls, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the former presidential candidate who was assassinated, or the nephew of the former president who was assassinated. And I think you've seen just in the last 6 weeks, his polling numbers just drop, just because he was probably a alternate vote for both Democrats and Republicans alike. And at this point, I think with the coalition around Kamala Harris, you might see that change. So that's something worth watching. So let's look ahead. Let's talk about August of 2024. The big thing coming up in this month, obviously, is the Democratic Convention. And probably within a week, hopefully we'll get this video out in time, but the selection of a vice presidential candidate. So your look ahead.
Well, she needs to get somebody who's very good, and she needs to get somebody who totally balances her. And otherwise, she needs a white guy. That's what she needs, and pretty much an ordinary style white guy. So it'd help to be a Christian as well, and that's going to be, I think, a factor in her selection. And she's got a smorgasbord on offer. There's a lot of good men who are available to her to select. I would have thought maybe Mark Kelly, because Trump would hate a noted astronaut and fighter pilot being on the other side.
Senator from my home state of Arizona.
That's right. Could be Andy Beshear from Kentucky. No longer the governor of North Carolina, because for some reason he's pulled himself out of that selection. And I think it's actually, personally, I think it's between those two. So we shall see whether that's true. Either way, they help the ticket a bit. And they can push people very hard for her. They're very potable in white working class areas because you've got to pick up some votes.
You know, that process that you're just describing has actually been very beneficial to Kamala Harris's campaign over the last 8 days, because each of these very qualified senators or governors have now spent the last 8 days campaigning, if you will, for their own shot at vice president, auditioning. And so the nation and the news media is being introduced as some very articulate and very forceful advocates on behalf of Kamala Harris and on behalf of the Democratic agenda. You're right, you know, we don't know, and by the time these videos are shared with our community, the decision will probably already have been made. But analytically, it's useful for our community to understand that traditionally in the United States, presidents select a vice presidential candidate that complements them and adds to the campaign something they don't have. And so 2016, at that time when then candidate Donald Trump selected Mike Pence, a conservative Christian governor, former congressman, it was to shore up his base among the religious right, among evangelicals, in the face of the scandals that he was facing even then. The interesting thing for me about, again, I'm looking back a little bit right now, is that if you look at the Republican convention in July, the selection of J.D. Vance, a very articulate, very smart, like an award-winning author of Hillbilly Elegy from the Senate, didn't fit the normal mold. No. It was a selection made to be more of a reflection of Trump rather than an alternative to. Obviously his youth is an important factor. I think they presumed that he would bring street credibility among Rust Belt, kind of Midwestern kind of states, including where he was raised in Ohio or Kentucky, etc. But when it comes to positions on abortion, on women's issues, on Ukraine and foreign policy, it's been a non-traditional pick. And I think what we're going to see from the Democrats is something probably more akin to a more traditional pick, designed to balance and go forward. Okay, convention. The Democratic convention, obviously, that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. Thoughts on that?
Well, the difference between them and the Republicans will be the old hands will be all out. So you'll see the ex-presidents. You'll see great ex-senators, and then they'll want to present their new. Well, they're pretty good new people in their show. The speaker's outstanding. They'll no doubt have him. He may even put in a nomination, I don't know. Hakeem Jeffries is very good. You've got you'll have a good bunch of senators out there and an outstanding group of governors. Female governors, the Democrats got 9 of them. It's which is important. Governors are very, very good. They're probably your best face because they're the people who know administration. There's a big difference between being a senator and being a president. There's less difference between being a governor and being a president. And so the Democrats have got plenty of people they can put out there and boast. And the blokes are pretty good too, who they've got as governors. So they'll have them out there. They'll want to have, I think, a lot of union leaders. They want a white working class. White working class is an interesting phenomenon. That's basically Trump's pitch and Vance's pitch. And Obama got 45% of them. Hillary got 34%. Biden got 41%. And Hillary basically lost the vote, or lost the presidency, because she didn't get Obama's numbers of white working class. Now that was a flaw in her campaign, which her husband desperately tried to get her to avoid. But she had all these ladies around her who didn't want any notice taken of Bill, because they did not like him at all. And so she was deprived of the best retail politician I've ever seen in the US. And that was a problem for her campaign. So that's why I say, as I go back, important to her is she's got nothing really to explain away from the Biden administration, only good things.
Now, you made it very clear that she has advantage of owning the Inflation Reduction Act, the massive infrastructure bill, the incredible investment in manufacturing, and yet when it comes to certain issues that are more sensitive, she's got a little bit of latitude because she's a new person. So it doesn't, all of the success without the baggage, and that's an enviable position to be in. Look, I think you're right about the speakers. We've already seen it this week. Governor Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, which is a swing state, highly articulate. Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, highly articulate. Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, she's the co-chair of the Kamala Harris campaign, highly articulate. The Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Now, I anticipate you're going to have a lot of just kind of younger, more exciting politicians up there speaking, and a very kind of forward-looking thing. The other interesting thing for me, we're recording this right in the middle of the Olympics, and that is, there is, among the things that got turned on its head in terms of the campaign, and I mentioned earlier that it used to be kind of a campaign about who you liked, who you disliked least, right? Because it was a contest between two deeply unpopular politicians on a national level. If the transition we've seen in the last 8 days continues, and again, there will likely be hard days ahead, good news seems to be good for the younger, more optimistic, more forward-leaning candidate. So every gold medal, every good jobs report, everything going forward. Whereas bad news, and again, there's plenty of that. What's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in the Middle East, and those things would tend to favor a party that is campaigning more on carnage and chaos. And so it's going to be a really interesting development as it goes forward. Obviously, if August is anything like July was, we're going to be meeting again in 1 month's time, maybe a little bit out of breath, trying to figure out what's going to be happening. But as it stands, we've got just a a relatively short time before the election, and it's good to have a chance to sit down with you and look ahead and look back. Thank you,
Well,
Kim.
thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you very much, mate. It's terrific.